Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guests are award-winning journalists Matt Taibbi of Racket and Gabe Kaminsky of the Washington Examiner. Make sure to subscribe here to the Undercurrents channel, wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews and the full premium experience. Our story today is a tangled web, but at its heart is a simple and troubling reality. The State Department sought to discredit journalists who reported on it. Josh Christensen of the New York Post published a bombshell report days ago, revealing an internal State Department memo from 2023. The memo is essentially a list of talking points that defend the State Department against evidence published by Taibbi and Kaminsky that showed the State Department's Global Engagement Center flagging alleged disinformation about COVID-19 directly to social media companies. So boiled down to its essence, this was government pressure to censor speech. Some of that speech, by the way, involved allegations that COVID-19 leaked from a lab funded in part by the US government, which was seen then as very conspiratorial by media and lawmakers, but is now viewed much more credibly. And that, of course, is exactly why the leaders of tech companies, for example, should tell the government to pound sand when it tries to suppress criticism of the government. Kaminsky reported on grants from the GEC, the GEC, to a group called the Global Disinformation Index, the GDI, which rated many credible media outlets, including Unheard, as lacking credibility, basically creating a blacklist for advertisers who wanted to steer their marketing away from literal disinformation, but ended up being told by a government-funded group to steer their advertising dollars away from perfectly credible outlets. At Unheard, for example, GDI used government resources to list us because we published criticisms of trans ideology, as our editor-in-chief Freddie Sayers reported back in April. Now, Republican Congressman Jim Banks, who the Post revealed was also a subject of states' talking points, is demanding Secretary of State Antony Blinken answer several questions about how a, quote, sloppy and hypocritical lie about him that falsely attributed a quote he gave to Kaminsky to Russian media. The Post reported on a letter Banks sent Blinken just yesterday. Government attempts to suppress and discredit critics are not new, but they're always important, perhaps especially now, as journalists like Rachel Maddow just this week nod right along as figures like former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton casually suggest potential prison time for people who spread alleged Russian, quote, propaganda, boosting Trump. That, of course, is what Clinton and her allies say to describe genuine foreign agents, but it's also how they describe people who've simply raised credible criticisms of, say, Hillary Clinton or the State Department itself. Joining us now to make sense of all of this are Matt Taibbi of Racket and Gabe Kaminsky of the Washington Examiner, the journalists at the center of this story. Matt, Gabe, thank you so much for joining us. All right, Matt and Gabe, thank you so much for joining us. And Matt, I'm going to start with you and just ask if you could recap the reporting that in this case had the State Department so upset. I believe the thread in question was a Twitter Files related post in January of 2023. Just tell us basically what you revealed that got them so upset.
So the initial Twitter Files thread about GEC that I wrote,
Global Engagement Center, right?
Yeah, the Global Engagement Center. I think it was from January 3rd of 2023. It was right after the new year. And we had a pile of internal correspondence in the Twitter Files that basically showed that the Twitter trust and safety executives were getting tired of having government agencies call them up and say, could you please take this and that and the other thing down? And they wanted to reduce the number of government agents that actually had the phone number of people like Yoel Roth. And the first agency that they protested about was the Global Engagement Center. And they listed a whole bunch of reasons why, including what they called the history of offensive information operations. There was other stuff in there about an incident in which GEC had sent a list of 5,000 names that they claimed were related to Chinese misinformation, but it ended up having Canadian officials and CNN reporters and all kinds of other folks in there. So it wasn't kind to the Global Engagement Center, but it wasn't the really damaging stuff that we found later. But clearly they didn't like being in the news because they were largely an anonymous presence nationally at that time.
Okay, and the Global Engagement Center is essentially an arm of the State Department, right?
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to leave out that crucial part. So, the Global Engagement Center was founded by an executive order by Barack Obama in his last year of office, and it was a new incarnation of what had been a counterterrorist messaging operation housed in the State Department that now had this new, broader mission for counter messaging of all kinds of threats. And the rub with GAC is that it had always been focused almost exclusively on foreign populations speaking Arabic and other languages. Now they were turning inward, and they were very focused on misinformation or disinformation that reached American consumers, and sometimes that involved the speech of ordinary Americans.
Really important because, Gabe, you also reported, as we continue with the alphabet soup of acronyms, on the Global Disinformation Index, and I have part of the State Department memo in front of me that Josh Christensen reported on. They say the GEC's work with GDI was limited to counter disinformation efforts in East Asia and Europe. As Matt just pointed out, that was obviously the origin story of the Global Engagement Center, but your reporting about the GDI is also what found its way into this memo, talking points essentially, for a media briefing that was being circulated at the State Department. So tell us a little bit about what you reported as it relates to the GDI, what the Global Disinformation Index is, and why the State Department was upset about that reporting from you.
Yeah, so in January and February of last year at the Washington Examiner, we were looking into this British think tank, the Global Disinformation Index. And the reason we were doing that is because we found that they crafted a public list of outlets that they deemed to be the riskiest, and they were all outlets that websites like the Washington Examiner, Daily Caller, Reason, they are all on the right. And there even were a place like Real Clear Politics, and then they
Unheard actually too.
Unheard as well. And they said that the most trustworthy news outlets were all on the left. So it was clearly a biased assessment of the most and least trustworthy. But separately, we found that the Global Disinformation Index, this British group, which actually has an American affiliated nonprofit group, that they crafted something called, and do craft it still, something called a dynamic exclusion list, which is a kind of, in their mind, a private blacklist of websites that each month they feed to advertisers with the intent of defunding and shutting down places that they don't like their speech, essentially. The kicker of it was we had found that the State Department's Global Engagement Center, the entity Matt was discussing, which essentially works with like the FBI, the Pentagon, all these agencies, that they granted $100,000 to the Global Disinformation Index. We also found that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a essentially a government nonprofit, it's fully funded essentially through congressional appropriations. You can FOIA the National Endowment for Democracy, that they granted money to GDI as well. And so it kind of launched this congressional inquiry. Matt had covered it a little bit in his reporting, and other people began looking into GDI. Unheard's done some great reporting on GDI as well. And I guess so that was what the State Department was not too happy about in that memo.
But Gabe, I have here right in front of me, the State Department says very clearly, no, the Global Engagement Center did not fund GDI to study, analyze, or report on social media platforms or accounts inside the United States. The GEC's work with GDI was limited to disinformation efforts in East Asia and Europe. This is another part of the memo that Josh Christensen reported at the New York Post just last week. Why is that wrong?
Okay, so two things about that. The first thing is that the first point they made in that memo about the Global Engagement Center has funded efforts to suppress speech on social media, I believe the language was. That is not true. The Global Engagement Center, through Matt's reporting, and we've reported on this also, was involved in the Election Integrity Partnership, a coalition of groups flagging through a system called JIRA, J-I-R-A, to the
EIP and the JIRA.
The EIP, GIRA,
the
CISA,
GEC,
CIS, LSAC, all this stuff. They were flagging stuff to social media platforms, and in certain cases, those platforms took action to delete that. So GEC has clearly been involved in efforts to suppress speech. The other thing is the State Department's response to these stories has always been to put forth broad claims about their involvement and say, our grant was only for some sort of foreign funding operation or foreign disinformation. And they haven't provided a lot of information about that. But moreover, I think the thing lawmakers have offered in Congress, and I think something other media outlets, commentators, their opinion, which I tend to agree with, is that it doesn't really matter. The point of those stories is not that a specific amount of money was allocated to a specific blacklisting operation. It's that the State Department funded a group that engages in this widespread suppression effort domestically. Our reporting at the Examiner never specifically said this $100,000 was specifically earmarked to attack the Washington Examiner. We said that this group engaging in this really messed up activity is funded by taxpayer dollars.
Your reporting on that has always been clear. Government-funded, taxpayer-funded group. Matt, you've covered this stuff for a while, and I'm curious, what you would say to the State Department or a defender of the State Department, which, there seem to be very many of them in the media who either will go to bat for the State Department or just ignore stories like these altogether, who say, this is normal. This is a government agency simply defending itself. This is just what that memo looks like. They're trying to handle a public relations crisis. What's so inappropriate about these talking points?
Well, for one thing, it's a little bit more extensive than just a memo. We've heard, Gabe's reported that they've briefed, a congressional committee really about both of us, kind of trying to discredit both of our reporting. And even in my case, going to some personal lengths, which is kind of offensive. But more to the point, I've been doing reporting for an awful long time, and I'm sure internally they do talk about how to respond to media. But there is always a presumption that journalists are people whose questions, that's part of our job, is to answer the questions of media. And sometimes they're good questions, sometimes they're bad questions. And, our way out, if the reporting is negative, is to correct those things publicly. It's not to discredit the reporters as people behind the scenes. You can see in this memo that they're not really addressing the factuality of the reporting. They're just looking for ways to kind of avoid talking about issues that are actually important. One of the key things that's really frustrating about all this is that GEC has a significant budget, and both Gabe and I looked at this. It's an image of 39 GEC contractors that was in an IG report, and 36 of them are redacted. And there's no reason the public should not know where nearly $100 million a year is spent on these kinds of activities. And they've hid this from us. They're not even telling Congress. They're telling them things like, we can't find the materials, or we spent it on radio programs without identifying what or where or in what country. So there's an evasiveness here that I would say is extremely unusual. Obviously, when you ask the Pentagon or the CIA a question, they're not going to answer. But it's a very strange response from the State Department.
And Gabe, another thing that both of you have reported on, both in Racket and the Washington Examiner, is where the story went after January of 2023, the March of 2023, when this document was being circulated, how the State Department has reacted in terms of the money that it allocates and has allocated since, or did not allocate since, to the GEC, to the GDI. Tell us a little bit about the reaction in the year plus since some of these reports started becoming public.
Yeah, so after our stories, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is essentially a nonprofit arm of the State Department, they had came out and said, we will not be funding GDI anymore because it, violates their mandate to act like GEC. They're only supposed to be acting in overseas ways, internationally. And this is an example of the GEC and NED funding, again, a group heavily engaged in domestic censorship efforts. So the National Endowment for Democracy had come out. Microsoft exited the political advertising space after it, but it took a very long time. I was emailing with them for a while. They said, after we first published our story, they said, we have opened an investigation, right? We have opened, whatever that means. And then
and Gabe, just tell us, so that Microsoft, a little bit more about that story, because you reported this. Microsoft was using the GDI to determine, like many other companies, where it should steer its advertising dollars, which obviously would then starve news outlets that rely on advertising dollars. of income simply because they were reporting something the government didn't like and ended up getting blacklisted by the GDI. Is that what happened?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Microsoft has an advertising platform called Xandr, Xandr, and Xandr subscribed to this GDI's dynamic exclusion list, which meant that each month Xandr would receive a report of the outlets the GDI doesn't like, and Xandr would then use that report to determine which outlets it would label in their advertising system as peddling disinformation, misinformation. In some cases, I think Town Hall was labeled as reprehensible and offensive, something they were very happy about. They were, kind of touting and maybe fundraised off of. So that's what the purpose of that was. Microsoft had come out and exited the political advertising space. Oracle is another company that subscribed to the list. We had reported prior that they exited the list. However, at Unheard, you guys actually had reported something, a piece not long ago that would make it appear that Oracle is still subscribing to GDI's blacklist, I believe. So Oracle kind of flip-flopped, it appears. But I guess a major development has also been lawsuits. So the Federalist, the Daily Wire joined in a lawsuit with Ken Paxton of Texas against the Global Engagement Center over their funding of GDI, and then NewsGuard, a company in New York that similarly rates news outlets based on their, alleged misinformation and disinformation levels.
And I want to give both of you a chance to respond to the State Department's allegations that essentially you didn't do your due diligence as journalists. You're both excellent journalists, so those claims I don't personally take very seriously. But Matt, I'll start with you. The State Department alleged that you had taken things out of context, and actually they, threw a whole bunch of accusations against you as a journalist. How do you respond to the substance of their arguments to discredit you?
So I don't know how much more due diligence they want me to do. I've sent out hundreds of Freedom of Information requests just about the Global Engagement Center. I've spent 2 years doing it. I've hired additional staff to look at this story. The Global Engagement Center, I thought, for a variety of reasons, was kind of central to what we were looking at in the Twitter files. There was a concept in there that we thought was incredibly dangerous. GEC sends out these reports that for instance, they have a report called Russia's Pillars of Information. They have ones about each different country. But one of the concepts that they promote is this idea of an information ecosystem, right? So they will spend time identifying a foreign agent like Russia or Iran or China, and actually look for accounts that are linked to those countries. But then they will have separate designations for accounts that they call, for instance, highly connective accounts, right? And these are accounts that have no link to any of those other countries, to those bad actors, but simply kind of rhyme content-wise with the same messaging. So in the Italian report, they put the former Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte in there. There is the former head of the Democratic Party in Italy, Nicola Zingaretti, who's sort of like the Bernie of Italy. And this is just guilt by association. And we saw kind of like en masse this happening in requests to Twitter for taking down accounts that they just alleged were connected, right? And you saw Twitter executives saying things like, yeah, if they're saying the same thing as Russia, they call that Russian, right? And it's an extraordinarily dangerous thing. And we were trying to get at the heart of how they had come to that conclusion, who they're contracting out to do that kind of work, how they came to be involved with the Election Integrity Partnership in Stanford. And we asked tons of questions. I emailed every name that I could find in one of those documents, and they didn't answer them. So I don't know what they mean by lack of due diligence, because that's kind of the definition of what we did.
Yeah. Gabe, I think at one point they said you didn't ask for an interview or something like that. Again, this was internal. It says very clearly on the memos, not for public release, which I'm sure they aren't pleased that it ended up being very much for public release, despite their best attempts, I'm sure, to stifle it. But tell us, what is your response to the State Department here?
There's an ironic nature of that line. He did not ask for an interview, because right before it says Gabe Kaminsky sent repeated questions to the State Department. He did not ask for an interview. they didn't answer a lot of my repeated questions. I asked a lot of, over roughly 12 emails in January and February. I asked things, really basic questions that anyone should be able to get from their own government. I asked, can you provide me with a link to the USA spending or grants.gov, wherever I can find literally just a public record of this grant that was given to the Global Disinformation Index? And they just said, I refer you to grants.gov. Well, I can't find it on grants.gov. That's why I'm reaching out to you. Also, we only knew that there was government funding because on the Global Disinformation Index's website, it said there was there was a note where it said we got money from the State Department. We couldn't find that anywhere. So they didn't answer a lot of questions that I had asked about that funding. I also think there's something really important to note about this memo. I think maybe the most important part is that near the end, the State Department intentionally quotes Jim Banks, a misrepresented version of a Jim Banks quote that was given to the Washington Examiner, but as appearing in a Russian state news outlet. And I think that does make it seem like Jim Banks internally is speaking to a Russian news outlet. And that's something that Banks, in a letter to the State Department today, had raised concerns over, and he's not too happy about.
And by the way, they also brought up my past living in Russia to the House Committee on Small Businesses. So there's one can make the argument there's an attempt to try to link both of us to Russia.
Right, and Hillary Clinton, of course, made this connection very casually and very vaguely, probably intentionally, just on Rachel Maddow's show this week when she suggested perhaps even prison time, criminal charges against people who boosted Trump, boosted Russian disinformation, which she has applied very broadly in the past simply to people who criticize her. And Matt, that's a question that I wanted to ask you as somebody who comes from, it's so easy in the story for the left to dismiss it as just conservative cranks getting what's coming to them. A lot of what they were flagging in your Twitter files reporting that upset the State Department was, my understanding is, information about the lab leak, information that was related to the pandemic, some of which has actually aged well and hardly into conspiratorial territory. This is not just about putting a target on the right's back, is it?
No, not at all. And there were also communications about the Yellow Vest movement in France. There were a number of leftist movements. Most of those had to do with disinformation, as they called it, in other countries like Italy, France, and the UK. But they were certainly looking at that idea. And again, their standard for this is, does the person saying the bad thing, are they reflecting the same idea as another country? They're not trying to suggest that those people are actually connected to a bad foreign actor, but they want them treated that way. And that's why what you mentioned with Hillary Clinton talking about boosting or spreading propaganda, this doesn't even require this new turn that they're taking. What's so insidious about it is that it doesn't even require somebody to make a mistake, to be libelous, to even have an unpatriotic intent. It can just be somebody in an agency like GAC, for instance, the Foreign Influence Task Force of the FBI, deciding that this messaging propagates something that the Kremlin might like, for instance, right? And that could be something as simple as, we don't believe the official version of Nord Stream, or we think, the COVID actually started in Wuhan, or, there's a million different things that they objected to. And we saw that whenever these things came up, they would send these huge spreadsheets that had terms like marked for deletion on them. And it was just enormous numbers of accounts. And, their whole conception of this was so just inexact, even compared to other agencies that do this kind of work. It was just frightening to look at.
Gabe, at Unheard, we were flagged for publishing Kathleen Stock, who the GDI said was a gender-critical feminist, or identified as a gender-critical feminist. And it was, publishing information that was critical, but in a way that's actually gone sort of mainstream in the UK at this point, of sort of trans ideology. And you spilled so much ink on the GDI, both of you did. And in your series, Gabe, Disinformation Inc., you got into some of the ideological disagreements, the State Department and then the GDI, apparently with no instruction from the State Department. But at this point, they wouldn't really need instruction from the State Department, I suppose, flagged as, being... What was they used a number of different terms, but potential disinformation, malinformation, misinformation. Yeah, they have a whole dictionary at this point to say the same dumb thing. But tell us a little bit about what they were flagging and why it wasn't just a matter of giving suggestions, but was something a little bit more given their government ties.
So one example of an area that GDI had publicized that they were flagging related to the COVID-19 lab leak theory. They basically branded any news outlets that even flirted with that as peddling disinformation and misinformation. Presumably, if we had, non-public records, we could see that that's the sort of thing they were flagging through the dynamic exclusion list to advertisers. But that is a completely ridiculous means to flag disinformation. It was first of all, it's still a theory. That COVID-19 may have emerged from a lab, but moreover, the FBI determined last year that the lab leak was the most probable result of the origin of COVID-19. Also, the Energy Department did, I believe, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So that
DOE.
Whoa, DOE, calm down there, guys.
Immediately discredits
getting a little kooky.
The Biden administration there. But moreover, they also, this is a weird one, they flagged an opinion piece by Con Carroll in the Washington Examiner, who's our opinion editor, that actually it was less of an opinion piece. I believe it was a write-up of a social science research study that concluded the findings were that on average, conservative men and women are happier and more satisfied with their lives than liberal men and women. And because of the conclusion of that study, was unfortunate or didn't match whatever GDI determines about politics, that was disinformation. There's probably other studies that have different assessments and they could share those, but they just determined that that's disinformation. So I think it was examples of opinions and then also just data actually that doesn't confirm certain biases they have. The other thing I just thought was important to note is that the Global Engagement Center, the State Department agency that funded GDI, as they continue to try to separate themselves from this notion that they have funded domestic censorship or groups funding domestic censorship, we had reported literally last week on this House Small Business Committee report that found that the Global Engagement Center was a participant, and maybe still is, we don't know, but recently in a private Google Groups email listserv in which the likes of Poynter, Snopes, Clemson University, and University of Washington professor Kate Starbird, and the National Endowment for Democracy discussed sort of their disdain for conservative media. They equated the Daily Caller to a white supremacy outlet and said that they did not believe that they deserved Poynter's fact-checking arm. And the Global Engagement Center, which is only supposed to be involved in international affairs, was involved in a chat about censoring domestic news outlets, and they still say they haven't skirted their mandate. I mean, that's ludicrous.
So, Matt, actually, I was going to ask you about the National Endowment for Democracy, a huge player in the saga, and one that comes out of the Cold War. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the National Endowment for Democracy was sort of publicly being framed by, I want to say this was late Reagan, early Bush, late 80s, early 90s, the administration as a public arm of what the CIA post-Church Committee, when a lot of the excesses and the abuses of the CIA came to light. This is now what the CIA can do publicly or through the NED. You guys mentioned you could actually FOIA the NED, for example, maybe to no luck, but still, they could do it more openly than they did during the Cold War in terms of dispersing information or fighting a so-called info war. So the NED is part of this constellation, GDI, GEC, all of this constellation of acronym groups. What role do they play in all of this specifically as the NED? And to what extent is all of this intentionally convoluted in order to obfuscate and make it very difficult for people to follow conversations just like this one?
So I think the story there you referenced, I believe it was written by David Ignatius at the Washington Post. If I remember correctly.
The Langley correspondent.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It might have been 1990 or 1991, But yes, the gist of it was the democracy promotion mission, all the things that the CIA used to do covertly, the NED, essentially we can now do it more overtly. And this coincided with a time when I went away to live in an expat community in Russia. And it wasn't the biggest expat community in the world. And this democracy promotion mission, I think people need to understand. It was so ironic for me listening to this whole concept of Russians are interfering in our election a few years ago or 8 years ago, whenever it was, because I was in Russia when we had consultants with an office in the Kremlin and were openly funneling millions of dollars to sort of pro-Yeltsin organizations to make commercials, to do leafleting campaigns, to do all kinds of things in country. And what's important to understand about this is that they have this idea that there is a very, very important role to be played by propaganda overseas, messaging in coordination with street protesters. All of this they believe is an essential, overt, legitimate function of agencies like the NED in consultation with, for instance, the IRI, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, right? But the problem is you cannot tolerate them bringing that idea home, because they look at politics overseas and they have very definite ideas, or they did in Russia anyway, or as to who should be elected and who shouldn't be elected. In 1996, Yeltsin was in 5th place at the beginning of the year, and when in a presidential election year, far behind the communists, and they were made no secret about not liking that, and they pushed very hard for these pro-democracy movements. Well, what happens when they start getting involved in American politics with something like the Election Integrity Partnership? And if you look at some of the partners of these organizations, and if I think GDI is maybe the most damning case, because you see them overtly politicizing messaging, using taxpayer money, in some cases defense money, funneled through the State Department to try to, control or influence the opinions of American voters. That's outrageous. It's a total violation of the charter of this organization, and it's still a violation, I think, of the Smith-Mundt Act of 1947.
Gabe, I want to ask, the people are actually voting right now, and we've seen Mark Zuckerberg, we've seen obviously Elon Musk, who's listed in the State Department talking points that the New York Post reported on for allegedly sharing all of your disinformation, both of you. Elon Musk, he says he's doing things differently at X when it comes to relationships with government intel agencies, FBI briefings. Mark Zuckerberg has said he regrets sort of taking so seriously briefings he was given about potential Russian interference in the 2020 election. What do we know about what could be happening behind the scenes right now? What can we suspect, or what can we expect might be happening behind the curtain right now, even after all of the sort of reckoning that's happened already?
Well, I don't know. It's really hard for me to say what could or could not be happening with the 2024 election and behind the scenes, but I do think it's important to look back at the 2020 election, and it's a lot of Matt's reporting and the Twitter files reporting, which extensively detailed examples of efforts by the federal government, efforts by agencies to urge social media platforms to remove content that they disagree with. And as far as 2024, I don't know. I do think that the level of scrutiny on this obviously has increased a significant amount, I think, in the past year and a half or so, that could make it pretty tough for the government to do these behind the scenes. But I guess we can't put it by them necessarily.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Matt? Gabe just referenced your Twitter files reporting about the frenzy in October of 2020 over the laptop. What do you think might be happening now?
Well, also, we have to look at the evidence in the Murthy v. Missouri lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, because they also, through depositions, they learned a lot that we didn't know about, the extent to which both GEC and the Department of Homeland Security were involved with operations like the Election Integrity Partnership. We do see that there have been lots of articles in which the people from the anti-disinformation world have complained that this intense scrutiny that they always describe as a right-wing phenomenon,
Right.
that has, thrown a monkey wrench into their kind-hearted efforts to,
Joan Donovan.
Right, yeah, Joan Donovan, Kate Starbird. Then, they all posed for these plaintive pictures about how, the noble researcher has been knocked off course. Now, how much do we believe that? Not very much in my case. I know I've heard sort of behind the scenes that there are a variety of different programs that are still going on. There has been an enormous emphasis on AI this time around, right? And we heard Senator Mark Warner even say, he openly announced that the government was going to be, all these agencies were going to be back in contact with all of the platforms because they expected the injunction on that behavior to be lifted, which it is. So I don't see why we should expect it should be any less. And also, companies like GDI or NewsGuard, if you have any kind of connection to commercial media, they're still having an enormous impact on the business. And there are people who are having tremendous trouble getting advertising revenue or being seen on the various platforms.
This was a fantastic conversation and a real treat to get to break some of this down with both of you, because nobody knows this beat, which is so important, better than both of you. So thank you both so much for spending time breaking it down and for your reporting.
Thanks so much, Emily. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gabe.
Well, that was fascinating. It's actually a privilege to be able to talk to Matt and Gabe about some of their incredible reporting in this space. Now, make sure that you are subscribed here to the Undercurrents channel. We are doing this every day. We are here with a new, fresh interview every single day. And we appreciate everybody who has subscribed, who's left those likes and comments. Make sure to subscribe also wherever you download your podcast. There's an audio version of this if that's how you like to get your podcast. That's released every day. And over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience. We do have a premium episode that is up there for subscribers only just this week. So make sure to tune in, and we will be back here tomorrow with more.